A blind millionaire writes love letters to a woman he's never met, unaware his true soulmate is closer than he thinks. What happens when the truth is revealed at the altar will change their lives forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Marcus Sterling sat in his luxurious office at Sterling Enterprises, running his fingers over his mahogany desk. The darkness that had been his constant companion for the past 15 years didn't stop him from being one of New York's most successful businessmen. At 40 years old, he had built an empire despite losing his sight in a childhood accident, but there was something missing in his life: love. "Rose, could you come in, please?" he called out, his deep voice carrying through the intercom. Rose Washington, his personal assistant of 5 years, entered the room quietly. She had been more than just an assistant to Marcus. She had become his trusted confidant, his eyes to the world, and secretly the keeper of his heart. "I need to write another letter to Elizabeth," Marcus said, straightening in his chair. "Are you ready?" Rose's heart squeezed in her chest as she took out her notepad. For the past year, she had been helping Marcus write letters to Elizabeth Parker, a woman he met through a high-society matchmaking service. What Marcus didn't know was that every time he dictated those beautiful, heartfelt letters, Rose fell more deeply in love with him. "I'm ready, Mr. Sterling," Rose said softly, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Dear Elizabeth," Marcus began, his face softening as he spoke, "your last letter brought sunshine to my day. When you described the sunset over Central Park, I could almost see it through your words." Rose wrote diligently, adding Marcus's poetic words to paper, just as she had done countless times before. Each letter was like a knife to her heart, but she kept writing, kept helping the man she loved connect with another woman. "You know, Rose," Marcus said, pausing in his dictation, "Elizabeth understands me in a way no one else has before. Through these letters, I feel like I've finally found someone who sees past my disability." Rose's pen trembled slightly. If only he knew that Elizabeth had never written a single word of those letters herself. The society woman had hired Rose, paying her extra to ghostwrite all her responses. Elizabeth had thought it was a perfect arrangement. She would get the wealthy husband she wanted, and no one would know she had helped crafting those romantic letters. "That's wonderful, Mr. Sterling," Rose managed to say, her voice steady despite her churning emotions. "I'm going to ask her to marry me, Rose," Marcus announced suddenly. "In the next letter. I know we haven't met in person yet, but when you know, right?" Rose felt the room spin. "Are you sure that's wise, sir? Perhaps you should meet first." Marcus shook his head, smiling. "Elizabeth and I have bared our souls to each other through these letters. What more do I need? To know. And besides, she knows about my blindness. I made sure to mention it in the first letter. She said it didn't matter to her." Rose's stomach twisted with guilt. Elizabeth had never read that part of the letter. Rose had kept that information to herself, knowing her employer's prejudices. She should speak up, tell Marcus the truth, but how could she break his heart? "Now where was I?" Marcus continued, unaware of his assistant's distress. "Ah, yes. Elizabeth, my heart has grown fuller with each letter we've shared." As Rose continued to write, tears threatened to spill from her eyes. The wedding would be a disaster. She knew Elizabeth would never accept a blind husband, no matter how wealthy he was. But Rose remained silent, torn between her love for Marcus and her fear of losing him completely if she revealed the truth. Little did she know that fate had other plans, and the wonderful world of lies she had become entangled in was about to unravel in ways no one could predict. The sun was setting over Manhattan when Marcus finished dictating his proposal letter. Rose's hand ached from writing, but her heart ached even more. As she prepared to leave his office, Marcus called out to her one last time. "Rose?" "Yes, Mr. Sterling? Thank you for always being here, for helping me with these letters. You've been instrumental in helping me find happiness." Rose clutched her notepad to her chest. "It's my pleasure, Mr. Sterling. I only want you to be happy." As she closed his office door behind her, Rose leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. She had helped create this fairy tale romance through letters, but soon the real world would come crashing in, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. Elizabeth Parker sat in her expensive Manhattan apartment, examining her perfectly manicured nails as Rose read Marcus's proposal letter to her. The society woman's face twisted with excitement at the mention of his vast fortune, but she barely seemed to register the loving words he had written. Well, Elizabeth purred, standing up to pour herself a glass of champagne. "It seems our little plan worked perfectly. Marcus Sterling, one of New York's wealthiest men, wants to marry me." Rose stood stiffly, holding the letter. "Ms. Parker, there's something you need to know about Mr. Sterling." "Oh, don't be such a worrier." Elizabeth waved her hand dismissively. "Just write him a beautiful acceptance letter. That's what I'm paying you for, isn't it?" "But Mr. Sterling is—" Rose started again. "I don't care what he is, darling. He's rich, and that's all that matters." Elizabeth walked to her window, overlooking Central Park. "Can you imagine? Me, married to Marcus Sterling, the society papers. We'll eat this up." Rose felt sick to her stomach. "Ms. Parker, please. Before you accept, you should meet him first." Elizabeth turned, her blue eyes narrowing. "Why? We've been exchanging letters for a year." "Well, you've been writing them, but same difference. He's clearly madly in love with me, and his bank account is exactly what I'm looking for." "The letters weren't just words," Rose said quietly. "They meant something. They were real feelings." "Oh, honey," Elizabeth laughed coldly. "Don't tell me you've fallen for him yourself. How adorable. The little secretary pining after her millionaire boss." She walked over to Rose, patting her cheek condescendingly. "To know your place, dear. Now write that acceptance letter. Make it good." With trembling hands, Rose wrote the letter, knowing she was helping orchestrate a disaster. But what choice did she have? She needed this job, needed the extra money to help pay for her mother's medical bills. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of wedding preparations. Elizabeth hired the most expensive wedding planner in New York, sparing no expense. With Marcus's money, of course. She barely spent any time with her fiancé, always making excuses about being busy with wedding details. Meanwhile, Rose continued her daily duties at Sterling Enterprises, her heart breaking a little more each day as she watched Marcus's excitement grow. "Rose, listen to this," Marcus said one morning, holding up a fabric sample. "Elizabeth chose silk from Italy for the wedding decorations. She has such exquisite taste." "Yes, sir," Rose replied softly, remembering how she had actually been the one to suggest that particular silk in one of the ghost-written letters. "You know what's strange, though?" Marcus continued, his handsome face thoughtful. "Every time we try to meet in person before the wedding, something comes up. Do you think that's odd?" Rose's heart raced. Perhaps you should insist on meeting her, Mr. Sterling." Marcus shook his head, smiling. "No, I trust her. Our letters show who she truly is. When you connect with someone's soul through words, nothing else matters." If only he knew how true those words were, just not about Elizabeth. The day before the wedding, Rose was helping Marcus with some final paperwork when he suddenly reached out, grabbing her hand. The unexpected touch sent electricity through her body. "Rose," he said seriously, "I never properly thanked you. These letters, they changed my life. Tomorrow, I'm marrying the woman of my dreams, and it's partly because you helped me express my feelings to her." Rose gently pulled her hand away, fighting back tears. "Mr. Sterling, Marcus, there's something I need to tell you." But before she could continue, Marcus's brother Richard burst into the office. "Marcus, the wedding planner needs your final approval on something. Elizabeth's demanding changes to the ceremony again." The moment was lost. Rose watched Marcus leave with his brother, knowing that tomorrow would change everything. The truth would come out, hearts would be broken, and nothing would ever be the same. That night, Rose couldn't sleep. She sat in her modest apartment, reading copies of all the letters she had written, both Marcus's heartfelt words and the fake responses she'd crafted for Elizabeth. The truth was there in black and white. Every feeling, every connection, every moment of falling in love had been between Marcus and Rose, not Elizabeth. But tomorrow, Elizabeth Parker would walk down the aisle to marry Marcus Sterling, and Rose would have to watch it all happen, knowing she had helped create this beautiful lie that was about to shatter into a million pieces. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect weather at St. Patrick's Cathedral. The historic church was filled with New York's elite, all eager to witness the society wedding of the year. White roses and orchids decorated every surface, their sweet scent filling the air. Rose arrived early, her heart heavy as she helped with the final preparations. She wore a simple blue dress, not as a bridesmaid, but as Marcus's assistant. Elizabeth hadn't wanted her in the wedding party, saying it wouldn't look right in the photos. "Rose," Marcus's voice called out. He was in a side room, already dressed in his tuxedo. "Is that you?" "Yes, Mr. Sterling," she answered, entering the room. Her breath caught at the sight of him. He looked incredibly handsome in his wedding suit. "How do I look?" he asked, adjusting his tie nervously. "I know I can't see myself, but I want to be perfect for Elizabeth." Rose swallowed hard. "You look very handsome, sir." "Rose, after all this time, please call me Marcus, at least today." He smiled in her direction. "Is Elizabeth here yet?" "She's in the bride's room getting ready," Rose replied, knowing Elizabeth had barely arrived, complaining about her hangover from last night's bachelorette party. The hours ticked by, and soon it was time. Marcus stood at the altar, his face glowing with happiness. The wedding march began to play, and the great doors of the cathedral opened. Elizabeth appeared in a designer wedding gown that cost more than Rose made in a year. She walked confidently down the aisle, smiling at the photographers, but as she got closer to the altar, her smile began to fade. Marcus turned his head toward the sound of her approach, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw his unseeing eyes up close. She stopped abruptly, 3 steps from the altar. "Elizabeth?" Marcus asked, sensing something was wrong. He reached out his hand. Elizabeth took a step backward, her face twisting in horror. "You're blind," she whispered, but in the silent church, everyone heard her. "Yes," Marcus said, confusion in his voice. "I mentioned it in my first letter." "No," Elizabeth said, her voice rising. No, this isn't what I signed up for." She turned to glare at Rose, who stood at the side of the church. You never told me he was blind." The congregation began to murmur. Marcus stood frozen at the altar, his face pale with shock. "I can't do this," Elizabeth announced loudly. "I can't marry a blind man. What will people say? How will it look in photos? No, this is impossible." With that, she turned and ran back down the aisle, her expensive dress rustling as she fled. The church erupted in shocked whispers. Marcus stood alone at the altar, his face a mask of pain and humiliation. Rose's heart felt like it would burst. Without thinking, she moved forward. "Marcus," she said softly, taking his hand, "I'm so sorry, but there's something you need to know." "Rose?" His voice was barely a whisper. "What's happening?" In front of the entire congregation, Rose finally told the truth. "Those letters you loved so much, Elizabeth didn't write them. She hired me to write them for her. She never read your letters either. I read them to her, but she barely listened. She only cared about your money." Marcus's hand tightened on hers. "You wrote the letters?" "Yes," Rose admitted, tears falling. "Every word, every feeling, every sunset description, and every dream shared. It was all me. I'm so sorry for deceiving you." The church was silent now, everyone watching this drama unfold. Marcus stood very still, processing everything. "All this time," he said slowly, "the person I connected with, the soul I fell in love with, was you?" "Yes," Rose whispered, "but I'm not who you think I am. I'm not from high society like Elizabeth. I'm just your assistant. You're the woman who saw past my blindness," Marcus interrupted. "The woman who spent countless hours reading to me, helping me, understanding me. The woman whose voice has been my light for 5 years." He reached up, his fingers gently touching her face, tracing her features. "I don't care about society, Rose. I care about what's in your heart, and you've shown me your heart in every letter you wrote." Richard Sterling, Marcus's brother, stepped forward. "Marcus, you can't be serious. She's a secretary, and she's black." Marcus turned toward his brother's voice, his face stern. "And I'm blind. Do you think I care about color? I care about love, about truth, about the soul of a person. Rose has shown me more love and loyalty than anyone in my life." He turned back to Rose, taking both her hands in his. "Rose Washington, you've been writing love letters to me for a year, but you've been showing me love for 5 years. Will you marry me? Right here, right now?" The congregation gasped. Rose could hardly breathe. "Marcus, are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said firmly. "What do you say?" Rose looked at their joined hands, his pale fingers entwined with her darker ones. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the whispers, not the shocked faces, not the society photographers frantically taking pictures. "Yes," she said clearly. "Yes, I'll marry you." The elderly priest, who had been watching everything unfold, stepped forward with a gentle smile. "Well then, shall we begin again? This time with the right bride." And so, on a beautiful spring morning in New York City, Marcus Sterling married Rose Washington. Not the woman he thought he would marry, but the woman he was truly meant to be with. The society papers would talk about the scandal for months, but Marcus and Rose didn't care. They had written their own love story, word by word, heart by heart, and now they would live it together. The news of Marcus Sterling's surprise marriage to his black secretary spread through New York's high society like wildfire. By the time Marcus and Rose left the church, reporters had gathered outside, their cameras flashing frantically. "This is outrageous," Richard Sterling paced in his office later that evening, while Marcus and Rose sat calmly holding hands. "Do you have any idea what this will do to our company's reputation, to our family name?" "Our company's reputation is built on excellence, not prejudice," Marcus replied firmly. "And as for the family name, I'm proud to share it with Rose." Richard slammed his hand on the desk. "She tricked you. She wrote those letters, deceived you." "She told me the truth when it mattered most," Marcus interrupted, "which is more than I can say for Elizabeth Parker." Rose squeezed Marcus's hand, drawing strength from his confidence. She was still wearing her simple blue dress, not the fancy wedding gown society would have expected, but she had never felt more beautiful than when Marcus had said, "I do." "The board members are calling an emergency meeting," Richard warned. "They're concerned about the company's image. Some are talking about forcing you to step down." Marcus stood up, his voice steady. "Let them try. I built this company from nothing. My blindness didn't stop me then, and prejudice won't stop me now." As they left Richard's office, Rose could hear the whispers from the employees, could feel their stares, but Marcus walked confidently, his hand on her arm, just as they had done for the past 5 years. Only now, she was his wife. Back at Marcus's penthouse apartment, Rose felt overwhelmed by the sudden change in her life. Just this morning, she had been preparing to watch the man she loved marry another woman. Now, she was Mrs. Sterling. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked softly, touching her face. He had always been able to read her moods from her voice. "I'm thinking about how much is going to change," she admitted. "Your family, the company, society, everyone's against us." "Not everyone," Marcus smiled. "My mother called while you were changing. She wants to meet you properly, as her daughter-in-law." This time, Rose remembered Catherine Sterling, a kind woman who had always treated her with respect. "Really? Really?" She said she had wondered why I lit up every time you entered a room. Apparently, even a blind man can't hide when he's in love. Rose touched his cheek gently. How long have you had feelings for me?" Marcus leaned into her touch. "I think I started falling in love with you years ago, but I was afraid that someone as vibrant and beautiful as you wouldn't want a blind man. When Elizabeth's letters started coming, the letters you wrote, I felt like I had found someone who understood me the way you did. Now I know why." Their moment was interrupted by Marcus's phone ringing. The caller ID announced it was the head of the board of directors. "We'll face whatever comes together," Rose said firmly. Marcus answered the phone, putting it on speaker. The news was exactly what Richard had warned them about. The board was concerned, shareholders were nervous, and there would be an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. After the call, Marcus sat quietly for a moment. "You know what's ironic? I've been working with a specialist for the past year on an experimental treatment for my type of blindness. That's partly why I wanted to get married. I might have a chance to actually see my wife one day." Rose's heart skipped a beat. "You never told me about this." "I didn't want to get my hopes up. The success rate is low," but he smiled in her direction. "Now I have even more reason to hope it works. I want to see your face, Rose. I want to see our children someday." Rose wrapped her arms around him, tears in her eyes. "Children? Of course. Beautiful, strong, mixed-race children who will help change this prejudiced world." He kissed her softly. "But first we have a battle to fight." That night, as they lay in bed together, Rose couldn't sleep. She watched Marcus's peaceful face and thought about all the challenges ahead of them. The board meeting tomorrow, the society backlash, the family drama, the press attention. It would be hard. But then Marcus pulled her closer in his sleep, and she knew that whatever came their way, they would face it together. Their love story hadn't started in the traditional way, with their eyes meeting across a crowded room. Instead, it had grown. Through years of quiet moments, shared laughter, and letters that spoke from one heart to another. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Rose thought about how tomorrow would bring new challenges. The board meeting could threaten everything Marcus had built. Society would try to tear them apart, but they had something stronger than all of that. They had truth, love, and each other. And sometimes, that's all you really need to change the world. The Sterling Enterprises boardroom was packed the next morning. Rose sat next to Marcus, feeling the hostile stares from the board members. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the table, a stack of papers in front of him. "As you can." "I'll see," Richard announced. "Yesterday's events have already affected our stock price. Several major clients have expressed concerns about the company's stability." "You mean they have concerns about my marriage?" Marcus said calmly. "Let's not pretend this is about anything else." An older board member, Mr. Patterson, cleared his throat. "Marcus, you've always been unconventional. We accepted a blind CEO because you're brilliant. But this marriage to your secretary, a colored woman, it's too much." Rose felt Marcus's hand tighten on hers under the table. Before he could speak, the boardroom door opened. Catherine Sterling, Marcus's mother, walked in with her head held high. "Well," she said, looking around the room, "I see the vultures are circling early today." "Mother," Richard started, "this isn't the place." "This is exactly the place," Catherine interrupted. "I hold 20% of this company's shares that my late husband left to me, not to you, Richard." She walked over to Marcus and Rose, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "And I fully support my son and his wife." Richard's face turned red. "This isn't about support. It's about the company's image." "No," Catherine said firmly. "It's about prejudice. The same prejudice that said a blind man couldn't run a company. Remember those conversations, Richard? Remember how you tried to take control then too?" The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Rose watched as Catherine pulled out her own stack of papers. "I've spent the morning talking to our major clients," Catherine continued. "Most of them care more about their profit margins than who their CEO married. And the few who have a problem with it, well, perhaps it's time we re-evaluated those relationships." "The shareholders," Richard began. "We'll be very interested in these," Rose spoke up for the first time, pulling out a folder. "Copies of emails between Richard Sterling and our biggest competitor discussing a hostile takeover after Marcus's marriage to Elizabeth Parker." The room went deadly silent. Marcus turned toward his brothers, heavy breathing. "You planned this with Elizabeth? To take control of my company?" I was protecting our family interests," Richard stammered. "You were protecting yourself," Marcus said coldly. "Rose found the emails last week. That's why she tried to warn me about Elizabeth, not that I listened well enough." Mr. Patterson leaned forward. "Mr. Sterling, Richard, is this true?" Richard's silence was answer enough. Catherine smiled grimly. "I suggest we take a vote. Do we accept my son's marriage and maintain his position as CEO, or do we side with a man who conspired with our competitors?" The vote wasn't even close. An hour later, Richard was escorted out of the building, his office already being packed up. The board members, many looking sheepish, congratulated Marcus and Rose as they left. "Thank you, Mother," Marcus said, hugging Catherine, "for everything." Catherine hugged Rose next. "Welcome to the family, my dear. And thank you for loving my son for who he is." Back in Marcus's office, Rose finally let out the breath she'd been holding all morning. "I can't believe we did it." "We?" Marcus smiled. "You're the one who found those emails. You saved the company, Rose." "I was just protecting the man I love," she said softly. "Like I've always done." Marcus pulled her close. "You know, I have an appointment with Dr. Harrison next week about the experimental treatment." "Are you scared?" Rose asked. "A little," he admitted. "But honestly, even if it doesn't work, I'm happier than I've ever been. You've given me something better than sight, Rose. You've given me love." Their moment was interrupted by Marcus's assistant, announcing that reporters were gathered in the lobby, wanting a statement about the morning's events. "Should we talk to them?" Rose asked. Marcus stood, straightening his tie. "Yes, it's time to show the world that love doesn't need sight to recognize what's real and true." As they headed for the elevator, hand in hand, Rose thought about how much had changed in just 24 hours. They had faced down the board, exposed Richard's plot, and gained Catherine's public support. But more importantly, they had shown that their love was stronger than prejudice, stronger than social expectations, stronger than anything the world could throw at them. The reporters waited below, cameras ready. But Rose wasn't afraid anymore. She and Marcus had fought their first big battle together, and they had won. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way, together, strong and proud of their love. As the elevator descended, Marcus squeezed her hand. "Ready to show New York what real love looks like, Mrs. Sterling?" Rose squeezed back. "Ready? For anything, as long as I'm with you." The elevator doors opened and they stepped out together, ready to tell their story to the world. The weeks following the boardroom showdown were a whirlwind for Marcus and Rose. Their story had captured the public's imagination. The blind millionaire who married his black secretary for love, defying society's expectations. Some newspapers called it a modern fairy tale. Others weren't so kind. "Don't read that trash," Marcus said one morning, hearing Rose sigh over the newspaper. They were having breakfast in their penthouse apartment, something that still felt surreal to Rose. "They're calling me a gold digger," Rose said, putting the paper down. "They're saying I manipulated you, used the letters to trap you." Marcus reached across the table, finding her hand unerringly. "Let them talk, we know the truth." The truth was showing itself in small, beautiful moments every day, like how Rose still read to Marcus every evening, but now she did it curled up next to him in bed, or how Marcus had memorized exactly how she took her coffee and insisted on making it himself each morning, even though it took him longer. Their life together was settling into a rhythm when Dr. Harrison called with news about the experimental treatment. "The preliminary tests look promising," the doctor said during their consultation. "Marcus's type of blindness, caused by trauma rather than genetics, makes him an ideal candidate. But I have to warn you both, this is still experimental. The success rate is only about 40%. "And the risks?" Rose asked, gripping Marcus's hand. "Minimal physical risks," Dr. Harrison assured them. "But emotionally, you need to be prepared for disappointment." As they left the doctor's office, they ran into Elizabeth Parker. She was with another wealthy-looking man, hanging on his arm just as she had once planned to do with Marcus. "Well, well," Elizabeth said loudly. "If it isn't New York's most talked-about couple." Rose felt Marcus stiffen beside her, but before either of them could respond, Elizabeth's new companion spoke up. "Sterling, Marcus Sterling." The man stepped forward. "I'm James Morrison. Your company's work on accessible technology is revolutionary. My sister is blind, and your new phone interface has changed her life." Elizabeth's face fell as James continued to praise Marcus, completely ignoring her attempts to steer him away. Finally, she stormed off alone, leaving James still chatting enthusiastically with Marcus about his company's innovations. "That felt good," Rose admitted, as they drove home. Seeing her realize what she gave up, Marcus smiled. "You know what feels better? Knowing what I gained." At home, they found Catherine waiting for them with news of her own. She had been working behind the scenes, reaching out to their business contacts and society friends. "The E. Sterling Foundation's annual gala is next month," she announced, "and every major business leader in New York has confirmed they're attending. They want to show support for you both, even after all the negative press?" Rose asked, surprised. Catherine smiled. "My dear, you and Marcus have shown people that love can overcome any barrier. That's a powerful message in today's world." The next few weeks were busy with preparations, both for the gala and for Marcus's upcoming treatment. Rose threw herself into the foundation work, determined to prove she was more than just Marcus's wife. She organized a new initiative, providing educational scholarships for underprivileged students, working late into the night on proposals and budgets. Marcus would often sit in her home office, just listening to her work. "You're amazing," he said one night. "I can hear it in your voice when you talk about helping these kids. You're changing lives." "We're changing lives," Rose corrected him. "Together." The night before the gala, they lay in bed talking about the future. Marcus's treatment was scheduled for the following week, and despite their brave faces, they were both nervous. "What if it doesn't work?" Marcus whispered in the darkness. Rose propped herself up on one elbow, looking at his face. "Then nothing changes. I fell in love with you exactly as you are, Marcus. The treatment, it's just a possibility, not a necessity." "But if it works," Marcus's voice was full of wonder. "I could see you, really see you." "You already see me," Rose said softly. "You see me better than anyone ever has." He pulled her close, his fingers tracing her face as they had done countless times before. Each touch was a reminder of how their love had grown, through words, through touch, through hearts connecting in the darkness. "I have something to tell you," Rose said, her heart racing. "I was going to wait until after the treatment, but I'm pregnant." Marcus's hands froze on her face. "What?" "We're going to have a baby," Rose said, tears of joy in her voice. "I found out yesterday." Marcus let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, pulling Rose even closer. "A baby? We're having a baby?" "Yes," Rose laughed. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "Whether I can see or not, our child will be the most beautiful baby in the world." They fell asleep, wrapped in each other's arms, their hearts full of love and hope for the future. Tomorrow would bring the gala, next week the treatment, and in several months their baby. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, they had everything they needed, each other. Outside their window, New York City sparkled under the stars, unaware that within one of its towering buildings, a love story was still unfolding. One that proved that the heart sees what eyes cannot, and that true love knows no boundaries. The Sterling Foundation's annual gala transformed the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom into a wonderland of lights and flowers. Rose stood in front of the mirror in their penthouse, adjusting her deep blue evening gown. Her small baby bump was barely noticeable, but knowing it was there made her glow with happiness. "You're quiet," Marcus said, coming up behind her. "Are you nervous?" "A little," Rose admitted. "It's our first big public event together. Everyone who's anyone in New York will be there." Marcus wrapped his arms around her, his hands finding her stomach, including our little one. Catherine arrived to escort them to the gala, but stopped in the doorway when she saw Rose. "Oh, my dear, you look absolutely stunning." She turned to Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Your father would have been so proud of you both." The drive to the plaza was filled with photographers trying to get pictures of them. But instead of feeling anxious, Rose held Marcus's hand proudly. They had nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. As they entered the ballroom, the hundreds of guests fell silent. Then, to Rose's amazement, they began to applaud. It wasn't polite society applause. It was genuine, warm, and welcoming. "What's happening?" Marcus whispered. "They're clapping for us," Rose said, squeezing his hand. "They're all clapping." James Morrison, the man they had met outside Dr. Harrison's office, approached them first. "Marcus, Rose, I wanted to introduce you to some people. Remember my sister I told you about? She's here tonight, and she's brought some friends from the National Association for the Blind. They're all users of Sterling Enterprises' new technology." Throughout the evening, Rose watched in amazement as person after person came to express their support. Business leaders praised Marcus's innovation in accessible technology. Society ladies who had once looked down their noses at Rose now asked her about the Foundation's new scholarship program. "Mrs. Sterling," a young black waitress stopped her quietly. "I just wanted to say, seeing you and Mr. Sterling together, it gives people like me hope. Hope that love really can overcome anything." Rose hugged the young woman, remembering her own days of serving at events like these. "Love sees no color," she said softly, "and neither does the heart." The evening's highlight came when Marcus took the stage to give a speech. Rose stood next to him, ready to help if needed, but he knew exactly what he wanted to say. "Many of you know that I'm scheduled for an experimental treatment next week," he began. "A treatment that might restore my sight. People keep asking me what I'm most excited to see if it works." He turned toward Rose's direction. "The truth is, I already see the most important things. I see them with my heart." His voice grew stronger. "I see my wife's kindness in how she treats everyone she meets. I see her beauty in how she fights for what's right. I see her love in every word she speaks, every touch she shares." He smiled. "And soon, I'll see our child, who's due to join us in 7 months." The ballroom erupted in congratulations. Catherine was openly crying now, and even some of the hardened business executives were wiping their eyes. "But whether the treatment works or not," Marcus continued, "I want you all to know something. Being blind taught me to see what truly matters. It taught me to look past appearances, past social status, past everything superficial. It taught me to see with my heart, and my heart sees Rose." Later that night, as they danced slowly together, Rose rested her head on Marcus's shoulder. "Are you ready for next week?" she asked softly. "I'm nervous," he admitted, "but not about whether it works or not. I'm nervous about being a good father, about running the company, about making you proud." "You already make me proud," Rose said, every single day. As the gala wound down, they said their goodbyes and headed home. Tomorrow would begin the week of preparation for Marcus's treatment. There would be tests, preparations, and more nervous waiting. But tonight had shown them something important. The world was changing. Love was winning. The same society that had once looked down on their marriage was now celebrating their baby news. In their car heading home, Rose described the city lights to Marcus, just as she had done in those letters so long ago. But now she wasn't pretending to be someone else. She was simply sharing her world with the man she loved. "Whatever happens next week," Marcus said, holding her close, "promise me one thing. Anything. Promise me you'll keep seeing the world for me. Keep showing me its beauty through your eyes." Rose kissed him softly. "I promise. And soon, Maybe you'll see it through your own eyes too. They both knew the treatment might not work, but after tonight, after seeing how love could change people's hearts and minds, they believed that anything was possible. As they drove through the glittering city, Rose looked at their joined hands, her dark skin against his light, and smiled. Sometimes the greatest victories weren't the ones you could see. Sometimes they were the ones you could feel, deep in your heart, where love lived and grew stronger every day. The morning of Marcus's treatment arrived with a mix of sunshine and clouds, much like their emotions. Rose helped Marcus pack his overnight bag for the hospital, her hands trembling slightly as she folded his clothes. "Everything will be fine," Marcus assured her, hearing her shaky breathing. "Dr. Harrison is the best in the field." "I know," Rose said, zipping up the bag. "I just can't help being nervous. We've been through so much to get here." Catherine met them at the hospital, bringing coffee and breakfast that nobody touched. The waiting room was quiet except for the soft tick of the clock on the wall. Rose held Marcus's hand, remembering all the times these same hands had traced her face, learning every curve and line. Dr. Harrison arrived with his team, his face serious but optimistic. "Are you ready, Marcus?" "More ready than I've ever been," Marcus replied, squeezing Rose's hand one last time. "The procedure will take about 4 hours," Dr. Harrison explained. "Then we'll keep him sedated for 24 hours, while the initial healing takes place. After that," he paused, looking at them both, "we'll know if it worked." Rose kissed Marcus goodbye, trying to keep her voice steady. "I love you," she whispered, "no matter what happens." "I love you too," Marcus smiled. "Both of you." His hand touched her stomach gently. As they wheeled Marcus away, Catherine put her arm around Rose. "Come on, dear. We have a long wait ahead of us." The hours crawled by. Rose and Catherine tried to keep busy with foundation work, but their eyes kept returning to the clock. Finally, Dr. Harrison emerged from the operating room. "The procedure went well," he announced. "Now we wait." Rose spent that night in Marcus's hospital room, watching his sleeping face. The bandages around his eyes made him look vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. She held his hand and talked to him softly, telling him about their future. "Our baby's going to have your smile," she said, rubbing her belly, "and your kind heart. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to see it all." The next day felt endless. Catherine brought Rose fresh clothes and tried to make her eat, but she couldn't leave Marcus's side. As evening approached, Dr. Harrison came to check on Marcus's vital signs. "He's doing very well," the doctor said. "We'll start reducing the sedation soon. By morning, we should be able to remove the bandages." That night, Rose barely slept. She felt Marcus stir a few times, his hand squeezing hers as he slowly woke up. "Rose," his voice was groggy. "Are you there?" "I'm right here," she said, kissing his hand. "Everything went perfectly. We just have to wait until morning." The sunrise seemed to take forever, but finally, Dr. Harrison arrived with his team. Catherine stood on one side of Marcus's bed, while Rose held his hand on the other. "Now, Marcus," Dr. Harrison said as he began removing the bandages, "remember what we discussed. The success rate is only 40%. If you don't see anything immediately, don't panic. Sometimes it takes a few days for the full effects to..." The last bandage fell away. Marcus kept his eyes closed for a moment, his hand gripping Rose's tightly. "Take your time," Dr. Harrison said softly. "Open your eyes very slowly. The light might be intense at first." Marcus's eyelids fluttered. Rose held her breath. Catherine grabbed her other hand. Then Marcus opened his eyes. At first, his face showed no reaction. Rose felt her heart sink, but then, "Light," Marcus whispered. I see light." Dr. Harrison moved closer. "Can you see my hand?" He held up 3 fingers. Marcus squinted. Three fingers." The room erupted in joy. Catherine burst into tears. The medical team began running quick tests, but Marcus wasn't paying attention to them. His eyes, still adjusting but definitely seeing, were fixed on one thing only. "Rose," he breathed, reaching for her face. "Let me see you." Rose moved closer, tears streaming down her face. Marcus's eyes widened as he took in every detail of her face. Her warm brown skin, her deep brown eyes, her beautiful smile. "You're even more beautiful than I imagined," he whispered. His hand touched her face just as it had done countless times before, but now his eyes followed the movement. "I've touched this face 1,000 times, but seeing it..." His voice broke with emotion. "Can you see this?" Rose asked softly, guiding his hand to her small baby bump. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. He just stared at her, drinking in every detail, his eyes filled with tears of joy. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat, wiping his own eyes. "We'll need to run some tests, make sure everything is working properly. The next few weeks will be crucial for adjustment." But Marcus wasn't listening. He couldn't take his eyes off Rose. "I see you," he kept whispering. "I finally see you." Rose leaned down and kissed him, not caring about the doctors or nurses in the room. When she pulled back, Marcus was looking at her with such love, it took her breath away. "You know what's funny?" he said softly. "Even though I can see you now, I realize I've been seeing you all along. With my heart." Outside the hospital room, New York City went about its business as usual. But inside, a miracle had happened. Not just the miracle of restored sight, but the greater miracle of love that had brought them to this moment. As the morning light streamed through the window, Marcus and Rose held each other, both seeing their future more clearly than ever before. The weeks following Marcus's successful treatment were filled with wonder and adjustment. Every day brought new discoveries as Marcus learned to navigate a world he hadn't seen in 15 years. Simple things that others took for granted became moments of joy and sometimes overwhelming emotion. "The colors," he would say to Rose, watching the sunset from their penthouse. "I never remembered them being this beautiful." Rose watched him, take in everything with childlike amazement. She had worried that seeing her properly might somehow change things between them, but if anything, their bond grew stronger. Marcus would spend hours just looking at her, memorizing every expression, every smile. "You scrunch your nose when you're concentrating," he told her one morning as she reviewed foundation documents. "I always felt it under my fingers, but seeing it's adorable." But not everything was easy. Marcus struggled with depth perception and reading, skills he had to relearn. Simple tasks like pouring coffee or signing documents became frustrating challenges. One morning, after spilling coffee for the third time, Marcus slammed his hand on the counter in frustration. "I should be better at this by now." Rose came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Hey, remember what Dr. Harrison said? Your brain needs time to adjust. You're doing amazingly well." Marcus turned to face her, his eyes softening as they always did when he looked at her. His hand found her growing baby bump, now clearly visible at 5 months. "I just want to be ready, to be able to take care of both of you properly." "You already do," Rose assured him. She guided his hand to where the baby was kicking. "Feel that? That's our little fighter saying Daddy's doing just fine." The pregnancy was progressing beautifully, and they had decided not to find out the baby's gender, wanting it to be a surprise. Catherine had thrown herself into grandmother duties, converting one of the penthouse's spare rooms into a nursery. One day, while Rose was at a foundation meeting, Marcus secretly visited his father's grave for the first time since regaining his sight. He stood there, looking at the headstone he had only touched before. "I wish you could see us now, Dad," he said softly. "See how happy Rose makes me. See your grandchild growing. You always said love was blind. I guess you were right." When he returned home, he found Rose surrounded by baby name books. "I've been thinking," she said, looking up at him with those eyes he never tired of seeing. "What about naming the baby after your father if it's a boy?" Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You'd want that?" "Of course," Rose smiled. "And if it's a girl, maybe after my mother." They were interrupted by a knock at the door. To their surprise, it was Richard, Marcus's brother, looking uncomfortable, but determined. I saw the baby announcement in the paper," he said awkwardly, "and then I heard about the treatment working." He shifted his weight. "Look, I was wrong. About everything. I let prejudice and greed blind me to what really matters. Family." Marcus studied his brother's face, something he hadn't been able to do during their confrontation months ago. He saw genuine regret there. "Would you like to come in?" Marcus asked. "Meet your future niece or nephew properly?" Richard's eyes filled with tears as he looked at Rose's pregnant belly. "I'd like that very much." That evening, after Richard left with promises to stay in touch, Marcus and Rose sat on their balcony watching the city lights. Rose was reading aloud from one of their old letters, a tradition they had kept even after Marcus regained his sight. You know what I realized today?" Marcus said, interrupting the reading. "When I was blind, I thought I was missing out on so much, but being blind taught me to see what really matters. It led me to you." Rose set down the letter. "How so?" "If I hadn't been blind, I might have been like Richard, judging people by how they look, what color their skin is, what position they hold. Instead, I learned to see people's hearts." He touched her face gently. "I learned to see you." And now that you can actually see, now I see even more clearly how beautiful you are, inside and out. He placed his hand on her stomach. And soon we'll see our beautiful baby. Rose leaned into his touch. Boy or girl, doesn't matter. Marcus smiled. Our baby will be perfect because it will be ours, a symbol of our love of everything we've overcome together. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear over the city. Marcus could now see the same stars he had once only imagined when Rose described them in their letters. Read me more, he asked softly. Rose picked up the letter again, but Marcus wasn't really listening to the words. He was watching her face as she read, seeing the love that had always been there even in the darkness. In just a few months their baby would arrive, bringing new joy and challenges. But for now, they sat together under the stars, two hearts that had found each other against all odds, proving that true love sees with the heart first and the eyes second. The city lights twinkled below them, but the brightest light of all was the love shining in their eyes as they looked toward their future together, a future they could now both see clearly. On a beautiful spring morning, exactly 1 year after their unexpected wedding, Rose went into labor. Marcus, who had been practicing driving again since regaining his sight, broke every speed limit getting them to the hospital. "Slow down," Rose laughed between contractions. "I want our baby to actually make it to the hospital." The delivery room was crowded with love. Catherine held Rose's left hand, while Marcus gripped her right. Even Richard was pacing in the waiting room, having fully embraced his role as reformed uncle-to-be. After 12 hours of labor, their baby made its entrance into the world with a powerful cry. The doctor held up their child, and Marcus, who once thought he'd never see this moment, burst into tears. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, "and she's perfect." Their daughter was indeed perfect, a beautiful blend of both her parents, with Rose's warm brown skin tone, Marcus's green eyes, and a head full of dark curls. They named her Faith Catherine Sterling, after both their mothers. "She's so beautiful," Marcus whispered, holding his daughter for the first time. His eyes, now clear and seeing, couldn't get enough of her tiny face. "She looks just like you, Rose. She has your eyes," Rose said softly, watching her husband cradle their daughter. "Those beautiful green eyes that can finally see." Catherine, watching from the corner, wiped tears from her eyes. "Your father would have been so proud," she told Marcus, "of all of this." The news of Faith's birth made the society pages, but this time there was no controversy. The headlines celebrated the arrival of the Sterling heiress, focusing on the love story that had brought her into the world. A few days later, they brought Faith home to the penthouse. The nursery, painted in soft yellows and greens, was filled with stuffed animals and books. Lots of books, ready for reading time with their daughter. As they settled into life, as parents, Marcus and Rose found their love growing in new ways. Late at night, when Faith woke for feeding, Marcus would sit with them, just watching his wife and daughter together. "What are you thinking?" Rose asked one night, as she rocked Faith back to sleep. "I'm thinking about that day at the altar," Marcus said, "when Elizabeth ran away because I was blind. It felt like the worst moment of my life at the time." Rose looked up at him, remembering that dramatic day. "But now I know it was the best thing that could have happened," he continued. "It gave me the courage to see what was right in front of me all along, to see you." 6 months after Faith's birth, they held a special ceremony at the Sterling Foundation. The foundation was launching a new program, combining Rose's passion for education with Marcus's commitment to helping the visually impaired. The program would provide scholarships and support for blind students and their families. During the ceremony, Marcus stood at the podium, holding Faith while Rose stood beside him. The audience was filled with faces that told their story. Catherine, beaming with grandmother pride, Richard sitting with his new girlfriend, a black lawyer who'd helped set up the scholarship program, even some of the board members who had once opposed their marriage. "A year and a half ago," Marcus began his speech, "I was a blind man who thought he knew what he wanted. I thought love came in a certain package with a certain pedigree. I thought I needed someone from my world, someone society would approve of." He looked at Rose, his eyes full of love. "Instead, love came in the form of a beautiful black woman who saw past my blindness, past our differences, past everything that didn't matter. She showed me that true love isn't about what you see with your eyes, it's about what you see with your heart." Faith cooed in his arms, reaching for her mother. Rose took her, and Marcus wrapped his arms around them both. "Today, I can see," I can see my beautiful wife, our perfect daughter, and all of you, but more importantly, I can see what really matters in life. Love, family, acceptance, and understanding. Later that night, after Faith was asleep, Marcus found Rose in their library. She was holding one of their old letters, smiling as she read it. "Dance with me?" he asked, holding out his hand. As they swayed together in the quiet room, Marcus looked into Rose's eyes, those eyes he had fallen in love with before he could even see them. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what? For showing me what love looks like, even when I couldn't. See, you showed me with your words, your touch, your heart." He kissed her softly. "You gave me sight long before the doctors did." Rose laid her head on his shoulder, listening to his heartbeat. Outside their window, New York City sparkled under the stars. But the real magic was here, in this room, where love had proven stronger than prejudice, stronger than society's expectations, stronger than blindness itself. In the nursery, Faith slept peacefully, her little face bathed in moonlight. She was their miracle, their proof that love knows no boundaries. She would grow up in a world their love had helped change, even if just a little bit. "I love you," Marcus whispered to Rose, "with every sense I have." "I love you too," Rose replied, "through every letter, every touch, every moment, seen and unseen." And there, in the quiet of their home, their love story continued, not ending, but beginning again every day with eyes and hearts wide open to all the beauty love could bring. The end.